So if you want to, thank you. So thank you everybody for joining us here today for our final episode in our webinar series. This one is focusing on the rural strategies. My name is Lisa LaRanger, and I'm the Strong Communities Program Manager in DOLA's Division of Local Government. And before we get started today, I'd just like to cover a few housekeeping issues. One is, as you just heard, we are recording today's session and we'll be posting the video on the Strong Communities website after the event. We ask that everybody stay muted until the Q&A at the end, and we'll have plenty of time for questions then. Please add your questions to the chat throughout the presentation, and we'll try and get to as many of those as we can during the Q&A at the end. And finally, please be respectful and considerate of everybody present today. With me today, we have Matt Ashby, Josh Olava, and Mike Scholl from Ayers Associates. And in our presentation today, we will be providing you with an overview of the Strong Communities Program, including eligibility criteria and timelines, and then provide a deeper look at how these strategies can benefit your community. As I said, this session is focused on how strategies can be adapted for rural communities. And our goal with these presentations is to provide you with the talking points that you need to gain support for these strategies from your communities, planning boards, and administrations. So can we go to the slide about the program?
Yep, we're there.
So the infrastructure, okay, thank you. The Infrastructure and Strong Communities Program was established by the legislature in 2022 under House Bill 1304 to provide assistance for local governments to adopt policy changes that support affordable housing and infill development, and to enable them to invest in infill infrastructure projects that support affordable housing. By supporting compact, connected communities, we're also aiming to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions, vehicle miles traveled, and household transportation costs through a partnership with the Colorado Energy Office and the Colorado Department of Transportation. Over the next year, we will be distributing almost $40 million in grants to Colorado communities. Next slide.
Go ahead, we're there.
We have two grant programs running this summer, the planning grants and the infrastructure grants. The planning grant program, we'll start there, provides funding for communities that want to remove barriers to housing development and provide opportunities for more affordable housing options within their communities. We have a suggested maximum award of $200,000 and a 10% match. And these grants can be used to cover the cost of hiring a consultant to help you with strategy adoption, pay for a housing needs assessment, and can also include administrative expenses that support the grant program, including staffing costs. Communities that receive a planning grant will be asked to adopt one or more of the strategies from our list of land use best practices, which we'll be kind of covering later in the presentation. Applications are open now through the DOLA grant portal and will be due by October 2nd. And we anticipate that we'll be making award decisions by December with grant agreements following that, and funds should be available in early spring. And then if funds remain, we will hold a second round, probably starting in February. Next slide. The infrastructure grant program is also open to Colorado municipalities and counties. Housing authorities and nonprofits are not eligible, but can be part of the cooperative agreement. The grant funds horizontal infrastructure, things like water, sewer, and power upgrades, street and sidewalk improvements, trail connections, and parks. This grant just closed the first phase of the application process with the letters of intent, and we're starting meetings with communities to review their applications. Decisions will likely be made in January. Next slide. So both of the planning and the infrastructure grants focus on the land use best practices that we're talking about today. This list was developed with input from several communities and advisors for what we think are some of the best strategies communities can adopt to support compact development and affordable housing. Planning grantees, as I mentioned, are expected to adopt one or more of these strategies as part of their grant agreement. And those who applied for the infrastructure grants communities that have adopted more of these strategies will be more competitive. With both grants, we have to have all of the money committed by the end of 2024, and they must be fully spent by October of 2026. We do have the list of practices on the Strong Communities webpage, and I do want to make mention that this list should be seen more as a framework than a to-do list. We want to help communities do the work that you need to do to create more housing within your communities, either through adopting some of these strategies or some other innovative tool. None of the strategies will work in every community, but every community should be able to find something that works for them. And if you're interested in learning more about the planning grant, please feel free to reach out to me with any questions. And I'm now going to turn things over to Matt and the rest of the crew for the rest of the presentation. Just a reminder, please include any questions you come up with during the chat, and we'll address them at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. All right, everyone. So, the first thing we want to do is highlight and help answer this question of what makes a strong community. And through the analysis and the research and working closely with DOLA, we really found that there kind of lies this notion of the triple bottom line benefits, that being environmental elements, social and economic values attributable to the community. Looking at efforts through these areas allows strategies and approaches to be customized to fit the local context and values, and really helping you find what works best for you. That's really the whole idea behind the Strong Communities Initiative, as Lisa had mentioned just a little bit ago. Looking at our land use best practices, these have been broken down into 7 strategy areas, and they help better describe the specific strategy or approach. And you see those listed here, and we'll go through each of these in a little bit more detail here in a minute. There are quite a few strategies captured throughout. And for this presentation, we're going to take a deeper dive into strategies that are most applicable and appropriate at the rural and rural resort context. And that's really to capture kind of the widest audience reach. Other strategies within each of these land use best practice areas we'll be touching on kind of at a high level and just introducing them, but additional information is available and will be made available on DOLA's website. And I did include the link to the Strong Communities website in the chat for everyone. Next, we're kind of looking at the strategy overview. For each strategy, the first thing we're doing is looking at the context. And again, whether that strategy is used more in that urban, rural resort, or rural context. And again, here we're focused a little bit more on that rural and rural resort community context, and really those strategies that can help you address affordable and attainable housing. And then we'll dive into kind of the deeper dive strategies for those rural and rural resort communities. And when we look at those, we'll start to look at that triple bottom line values that serve as kind of the talking points for the community. Things that you can use as you start to incorporate or look to adopt any specific strategy at your local level. And then finally, within those deeper dive sections, we'll look at the overall level of complexity of that strategy and really how that relates to local capacity needs or resources. And then we also have included a case study under each strategy for additional information. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Mike Scholl to jump through our first few land use best practice areas.
Cool. Thanks, Josh. So we were, as Josh mentioned earlier, we broke it down into the 7 different areas. And so we're going to go through each of them, but we're not going to touch on every one. We just pulled the ones that we thought would be most germane for this audience. It doesn't suggest that you need to be limited to the ones we've highlighted. You can certainly adopt any one that's included in the list that the state put out, but we just felt like these would be make the most sense. So within compact development, we're going to highlight kind of number 1 and 3, the higher density in the core and reduced minimum lot sizes opportunities to, but there's also the density bonus program. So the strategy number 1, for compact development, the higher density in core and service. So essentially what this is allowing for a higher, just as it suggests, a higher level of density and proximity to within proximity to your service centers. And I know In rural communities, I think our experience has been sometimes, you're because your entire town footprint may not be that big, that you have kind of a little bit of a bigger, or relatively speaking, no matter where you develop, I think there's some proximity to those service centers, but kind of thinking about how it relates to kind of hospitals, education systems, employment centers, and things like that, that the drivers of housing in your community will be important. And I think that in terms of the how, it's really thinking about making sure you have that reference in your comprehensive plan, and that you have the zoning regulations that are consistent with that to allow for a greater, some greater density, and around those kind of traditional core in those service areas. From getting to the triple bottom line benefit, obviously the key economic, reduction in commuting costs, the community, if you can maintain a community identity through some of the development that occurs in your core, lower infrastructure costs and higher tax revenue per acre. If you can develop kind of more compact development, obviously you get some revenue benefits from that as well. And then again, from a social perspective, access to service and jobs, walkability, healthier lifestyle, and greater land, and for environmental, greater land conservation, less traffic, and pollution, and in some cases, building reuse. I think part of in going through some of these details, I think it's trying to kind of understand kind of the key factors that I think that they're looking for within those qualifying strategies in the, as part of the infrastructure and the planning grant. So just a quick case study. This is a City of Craig. It's a 1.3 acre, 20 unit for sale project. It's right in the heart of the downtown. It was the former brownfield site, a hospital that had was demolished. They built a new hospital on the west side of town. This site became available. It was remediated through actually some EPA brownfield funding, and the site became available. The lot had been vacant, and so so they proposed a partnership with the City of Craig and the Craig Housing Authority to do a 20 unit. They badly need, again, trying to be very context sensitive. They really needed new units that were for sale. And this kind of fit the bill. So they're looking at doing a compact development. It's 4 5-plexes. You could see from the image on the bottom left, the footprints. The end units are 3 bedrooms, and the interior units are 2 bedroom. The density bonus program. This is under the compact development strategy number 2. This is a partnership with private developers to allow for greater density, to allow for greater density within development projects. I think this is one that's worked well, particularly in mountain communities. I think in resort communities that are doing very high density development. Obviously, you're being able to create some efficiency in development, but make sure that you have your code elements to accommodate those increased densities, and make sure the community benefits are clear, and that you're prepared to negotiate with any private developer. So the minimum lot size requirement, this is the other one. In a lot of communities, particularly in smaller kind of non-resort rural communities, a lot of times, our experience is that communities, you can generally do smaller lot size. It's not articulated clearly. And I think part of what is important, or what the expectation is through this program, is to make sure that those lot sizes are clearly defined. You allow for a greater economy of scale, or for smaller residential, for smaller residential types. And I'm getting ready for vacation, so I'm stumbling over my words a bit today. But I think part of that is looking at different allowing for different housing types. As you could see from the image, this is from Flagler, Colorado, which is a small town on the Eastern Plain, allowing for duplexes on 5,000 square foot lots. They made some code requirements that looked at the setbacks and other things that impact smaller lot sizes. So, make sure to consider all aspects, including the parking and streetscape, and building design standards to balance that density. I mean, in part because, you're creating, when you have the smaller lot size, you have the opportunity for more compact development. Again, from an economic benefit, it's lower infrastructure, lower front end cost, and the ability to build in more attainable units. You're reducing your land consumption, and you have the opportunity to preserve some key open space. I think from that triple bottom line benefit. The case study that we pulled that we're using for this is the town of Flagler, again, that we mentioned. They adjusted their zoning district to allow for the smaller lot size, and really what they did was they were able to define what the lot size require, or what a smaller lot size that they would allow, along with the other design and simplified design criteria. They didn't have anything before, which allows them to be eligible to go forward with some of the infrastructure funding and other funding opportunities to build in housing. So that was, Josh, did you have anything to add to that? Because I know you help with that code.
Not too much, Mike, but really a lot of times, looking at minimum lot sizes in kind of that rural context, it's going to be very different than minimum lot size in a front range or urban context. And so it again is something that's very right sized for your community. And, maybe your code doesn't say anything to that effect. And so adding some parameters and criteria to that effect will help guide development. And a lot of these communities, Flagler example, they allowed, administratively, they were allowing duplexes, or, ADUs is another example, which, we'll touch on at a high level here with this next section, but it wasn't in their code. And so part of it was giving their staff some of the tools they needed to be able to do their jobs more effectively. So thank you, Mike.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for that. So the next we're gonna look at housing diversity. We're gonna touch on kind of the multifamily housing options and a little bit on alternative building options. So for multifamily options, really what we're talking about is allowing more multifamily as a use by right in your community. And multifamily means generally it's everything above kind of single family zoning. So it's not just, I think one of the important thing, particularly in in rural context, it doesn't mean high density vertical development. What it can mean is things like allowing for duplexes and triplexes and things like that create more of what we call kind of a gentle density in areas that have either view sheds, environmental or conservation kind of concerns. So allowing for a little bit more density, ability to get more units in, but with being within the context of your community. Again, and these create kind of a more efficient use of infrastructure, create more options in the marketplace, a greater diversity of housing. They can create opportunities for different ownership at different price points, especially if you can pair that with smaller lot sizes and smaller units. A little bit easier to build in starter homes, and you create some efficiency and you combat sprawl, at least a little bit, from a social benefit. And one of the things I wanted to point out with some of these options that we're talking about, they can be layered with other strategies as well. So, multifamily housing options with small lot sizes, things like that, there's definitely going to be some overlap in how those are applied within your community. We pulled up the example in Telluride. Their zoning district allows for a mix of residential uses. They provide year-round housing for employees who work within the school district. It includes some multifamilies you could see from the images, and as well as some tiny home units. It can, when thinking about implementation, you be mindful of what's required in your comprehensive plan. And and especially I think in what we found in smaller communities is think more about a simplified approach, um, as opposed to creating a lot of different zoning districts. If you create a fewer districts with a lot more flexibility, I think it's a lot easier to administer, than it is, than having a lot of different zoning. Um, so accessory dwelling units, this is again, this is a way to build in some gentle density, allowing them as a use by right in single family zoning districts, so you can kind of build in where the infrastructure already exists. The one thing to keep in mind, or the challenge with doing ADUs, is both parking requirements can create some cumbersome regulations in terms of their use, and also tap fees. I found that in a lot of communities, ADUs require separate taps within both water and sewer taps, which kind of skew the economics a little bit and make them a little bit more challenging. So something to keep in mind when you're looking at ADUs as a use by right. So the other one is alternative building options. Um, Obviously the thing right now in Colorado is the modular housing, with the Fading West building systems, and other communities that are using modular is a way to kind of really to is a way to kind of overcome some of the labor shortage issues. I think modular provides some benefit to that, though I will say, from my experience, modular doesn't necessarily mean less expensive or cheap. You can go with lower cost alternatives, but in terms of the when you're thinking about pricing between modular and stick build, a lot goes into it, and the pricing they're fairly comparable, but it does allow in a lot of communities where you don't have deep pools of contractors and subcontractors, it helps to overcome some of those challenges in communities. So just making sure that you have local codes that remove those prohibitions, on some of those uses, I think is important. Again, I talked a little bit about some of the benefits. You don't have as much local workforce required to build that. The construction is lower waste and more efficient. And it can be cost effective, but like I said, I think just go into it with, understand that there are some additional costs, particularly horizontal and infrastructure costs. The other one we wanted to talk about too is tiny homes. I think those that's another building option, I think. And again, thinking about kind of layering the different strategies, having smaller lot sizes works well, obviously, and housing diversity, which we'll talk about a little bit more. That that can be an option in a lot of communities where you want to maximize land and create a higher unit yield. So thinking about tiny homes and how that works with smaller lot sizes, I think, is important. So again, go through this a little bit. The farm, I think it's fairly well known in Buena Vista. That was the kind of the big modular project that they did in Buena Vista. It provides a pretty good example. So the next kind of strategy we're going to go into is affordable housing. And we're going to talk a little bit about affordable housing as a use by right. I think part of, what we're trying to do is kind of lower the regulatory barriers to make it easy to develop affordable housing, and being able to create a variety of building types that fit within your local context is important. And again, when you have that in your code as a use by right, you're really reducing time. I think, having been through a number of development projects, I think that time is a critical component of any development. And I think, to the extent that you allow for it in your code, I think will aid in kind of, facilitating new housing development that is affordable. Inclusionary zoning ordinance. This is another one. It can vary. This can vary in overall structure to fit the local context and goals in policies of the community. I think the inclusionary zoning, which allows, a lot of times is used within PUD structure. That where you offer developers incentives to include affordable housing or fee waivers or expedited approval. I think having these laid out clearly in your code or in a housing policy is important if you're looking to use this as a tool. I think one of the things you have to keep in mind is just be clear what it is you want in terms of, what it is you want in terms of affordability, housing types, and things like that. So when you're going in to negotiate or have those discussions with developers, you can be very clear. You can be very clear with what you want in return for allowing a more flexible application of your code. The other one I think is used in a lot of, somewhat in rural communities, is the land bank or the land trust donation program. This is a way to preserve affordable housing into perpetuity. You can, if you have publicly owned land that is available for housing, I think you can, going that land trust model is a good way, is a good approach. There are some challenges with it. It can be, there's some complexities with using it with kind of upward appreciation, different things like that to keep in mind when you're looking at this. But like I said, land is a finite resource, and particularly in mountain, in a lot of mountain communities where it's challenging, the topography and makes it difficult to develop. You can't develop on nice grid patterns like you can in bigger Front Range communities, and so you have to be sometimes a little bit more creative, and I think for surplus land or public that may not be ideal for kind of larger scale housing development, land trust model can work to provide some housing units. The other one, affordable housing subsidies and incentives. I mean, there's a lot of different ways that these can be structured from fee, like donations of land, fee waivers, and other kind of incentives, the density that we talked about, the density bonuses and things like that. The one thing is just make sure you have a clear policy of when this assistance will be provided, what you're offering, and how you go about your approval. Again, I think when you're looking at these, time is a critical factor. And so, having a system or a policy that's clear and understand what it is you want. Like I said, it's really important when you contribute something on the public side, either land or a fee waiver, to some extent, you become an equity investor in that project. You're contributing financial benefit to that project's success. So so understanding what you want in terms of your return is really important, and obviously, as communities, we're in the forever business is one of the things I like to tell our clients. You're in the forever business, so make sure, you may not be taking necessarily a financial return, but you want to make sure that whatever's built is a clear benefit to your community and can serve you for a long time. So just something to think about with, again, some of the incentives. You could provide some support to address the affordability and boost affordable unit inclusion, and you can use it to incentivize. Like I said, if you have opportunities to incentivize housing near where job and activity centers, I think it's a strategy to kind of, again, layer on, with different strategies to kind of maximize your opportunity to facilitate those new development of new housing units. The case study that we were going to provide this was the Southeast Colorado Economic Development District. They actually was quite remarkable. They coordinated within that. It was 8 or 9 counties, and a number, I think it was over a couple dozen small communities, provided land and lots and did the horizontal infrastructure, and they cooperatively recruited a developer. So what they did was they, once they had all the lots together, they bundled them, and then they were able to kind of leverage that to recruit a developer, and then each of the communities did the horizontal work themselves, and the developer is able to come in and build, bring his crews to the different communities, and create a little more of an economy of scale and an efficiency, so that the units could be sold in the 200,000. Some of them were actually even below, or intended. They were working to price them below 200,000. So it's a good model. It's a lot. It was a heavy lift, but I think that was but they've achieved some success down in the Southeast Colorado. The reduction in development fees, this is, I think, in line with both this and with providing incentives. I think that, thinking about, again, what are the criterias for what are the criteria for providing that fee reduction, and what do you get in return? And think about, I think particularly with impact fees, understanding what the backfilling requirements may be. I mean, if you live in a community that has a separate water district, or a water sewer district, things like that, make sure that you're not required to find cash to backfill that. Though you can do that. I mean, if it's a priority for your community. But I also, with this, it's important, obviously water is a big consideration, and as part of the strong communities, I mean, the idea is to limit the need to extend infrastructure. So just kind of be careful or be mindful of that element as well. Oops, sorry, I jumped. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to my colleague, Josh Olhava.
Thank you, Mike. All right, so the next best practice we're going to touch on briefly, as you can see here, is growth management. And I know some of you on the call, especially if you're from smaller rural areas, are probably like, growth management, definitely not applicable to us. But we want to highlight a couple areas where you may have some development pressures occurring, or some areas that you need to kind of think about how that works. As development moves out from the Denver metro area or some of the other metro areas, pretty soon your community might start to feel some of those pressures. And so how do you get out ahead of it and help control kind of that future destiny and fate, kind of to Mike's point, that forever business notion of where you're extending your services. And so these strategies are really geared towards promoting the targeted growth locations within the community, and really help foster that notion of that fiscal responsibility, thinking of where are you extending those services, the water lines, the sewer lines, the roads, but then also the long-term maintenance of those. It's not just they go in once, but there's that long-term maintenance, and are they serving the most number of constituents within your community, the best bang for your buck approach. As part of the rural linkage with these strategies, they really help protect ag farmland, as well as, designated open space areas or natural resources. Again, really based on your context and what you're seeing around your community. So the first one we're going to just kind of highlight at high level is annexation policies. This definitely is a strategy you'll see more so if you live or have a community near the edge of a larger metro area or another community. Looking at opportunities to kind of collaborate on that shared area in between your growth areas, who's annexing what and where, so you don't get into the old days of the flagpole annexation wars, trying to get as much of that commercial highway land as possible. But how do you strategize together, and how do you work together, whether that's some tax sharing incentives or who's sharing what resources and services and infrastructure. And so this is one topic that it definitely applies, very much context sensitive. So really want you to keep that in mind as you're working through your plans and your guidance. But the big takeaway here is, as part of your 3-mile plan, that's part of a comprehensive plan through our statutory requirements here in Colorado, 3 miles for some communities may seem daunting. So then do your 3-mile plan, but then bring it back in and look at that immediate cooperative planning area, the area right around the edges of your community, because that's where you'll probably see the most significant pressures in the near future, as well as the extension of your services. Next, we're going to dive down into the intergovernmental agreements. This is a topic that definitely applies across the board, and really, as you started to hear and probably have caught on with, a lot of these best practices and strategies are interrelated. A lot of them work together, work in tandem. One comes before the other or leads into the other, and intergovernmental agreements is one of those areas. And it can address really a lot of different topics, from infrastructure to land use planning to zoning to resource protection. So there's a lot of different areas that can be utilized in a lot of different contexts. Again, really geared towards your local context. And as the saying goes there, it's really to build that win-win scenario for you and or the county and other municipality that you're going through. And intergovernmental agreements can also be with special districts. So keep that in mind as you're working through these. In terms of the triple bottom line, you can really see here, I'm not going to read through every point of this slide, but it is really that infrastructure approach. How are you sharing and extending those resources from an economic standpoint to be most efficient? In the social lens, it's really that effective service provider scenario, really working collaboratively so it builds those relationships. And then on the environmental side, again, where should the community grow? How can we protect, the prime agriculture, farmland, or those open space and view sheds? And then in terms of our case study, we have Boulder County on here, which, kind of jumps between kind of that rural resort, rural, definitely urban in some areas. So this one can really work across the board, but I also want to mention that DOLA has a lot of great intergovernmental agreement examples on their website to fit a lot of different contexts and a lot of different uses. And so I would definitely encourage you all to take a look at DOLA's website if you're starting to think through intergovernmental agreements, as the level of complexity can jump all around. It can be kind of that mid-level as we have shown here, but depending on what you're wanting to do, it can spike all the way up to the most complex or all the way down to something that you can move through fairly quickly through your local boards. So again, definitely a big plug for DOLA and checking out their website, as they've collected a lot of great resources on intergovernmental agreements. The next strategy, again, high level kind of approach, is the urban growth boundary. And, as I mentioned, this isn't just for metro areas, but it can help smaller communities plan where those future homes or future neighborhoods can be built. And again, tying into that efficient extension of infrastructure and resources. It can also help with the development community, builders, developers, understanding where the community is anticipated to grow in the future and where they should look to invest and be a community partner. This always starts with the comprehensive plan, thinking, where are those growth areas at? If you don't have a comprehensive plan or you have other visioning documents, that would be kind of the basis to start looking. But then really looking at your zoning and the types of land uses and the amount of residential uses versus commercial versus industrial that you're placing in these areas. So that way they're still interconnected with the community. There is still the appropriate extension of services, and that people can live close to where they work and or be able to get there, which we'll talk about a little bit later in terms of transportation strategies. And then the last topic we're going to touch on, again, at a high level here, is the transfer of development rights. Very much more of kind of that urban rural resort context. You see a little bit in the rural side of things, but it can be fairly complex developing a transfer of development rights program, because you really need to start identifying areas where the credits can be transferred to and from. And you can see here in the visual from Summit County, it's kind of a map that's showing where density comes from and where it gets placed and where those development permissions are kind of transferred around. And it really helps to preserve the different open space areas, agriculture, farmland, in and around your community. And so in addition to some of the strategies we talked about earlier, land trust, land banking, growth management, with the urban growth boundaries, transfer development rights is kind of another one of those tools. But again, it is one that can be a little bit more complex, and take a little bit more in terms of resources and subject matter expert.
Hey, Josh, if I could weigh in on this too,
Please.
I know part of the challenge in a lot of rural communities is you already have a lot of publicly owned land, and so I think that becomes adding more from kind of you can use it as a conservation strategy, but I also think sometimes too, think about how you can use a transfer or something like this to achieve site control, to do affordable housing too, particularly in areas, in high cost areas and high cost resort towns too. Because I think when you're thinking about affordable housing, another kind of thing that I'm fond of saying is, if you control the real estate, you control your future. So if you're able to kind of get control of a develop, be able to have a trade or something with a developer for the purposes of developing housing, I think it can work in your benefit. And it's not like you're just setting aside land, public land. 'Cause I know in a lot of communities that it can be a little bit of a hot button issue when 80% of the land is publicly owned already in some of those communities. So thanks.
Fantastic points, Mike. So next, I believe we're jumping down to our next strategy area, which is districts and subdivisions. And so we're going to dive into a couple of the strategies here. And the first one up is PUDs, looking at PUDs from a high level. A lot of rural communities don't use PUDs, or have kind of dabbled with them a little bit. I'm starting to see more PUDs kind of fall off on some smaller communities' radars, just because of the complexity or the uncertainty that can be built in with those. But really, the idea with PUDs is that with affordable housing, when you approve a PUD, it usually allows a developer to build a certain neighborhood development based on different criteria that isn't already allowed or approved under your code or your zoning regulations. And so what is it the community can get back if they're incorporating a PUD? And some of that could be affordable housing. So as Mike mentioned earlier with inclusionary zoning, is there some metrics that can be set up to establish that X% of your PUD development has to have affordable or attainable housing, and what levels? So PUDs are one of those great tools that developers love to use. Communities love it for the flexibility, but then really establishing what is that community benefit we're getting back from allowing a PUD, allowing something outside of our norm. So that's really what this strategy starts to dive into. Next one up is infill incentive district. And again, this one is one you tend to see more on the urban side of things, kind of the resort community areas where you're designating an area within your community as an infill incentive district. And this allows for kind of a mix of land uses. Sometimes it's creating a new kind of urban center, urban core within the community. And a lot of times there's tax abatements, fee reductions, and other incentives tied into these infill incentive districts. They can be kind of complex, but again, they can also fall in kind of that mid-level of complexity depending on how you're setting it up and what you're doing with it. But the key here is to really review those fees, your applicable fees, and identify those options where infill will have less impact on infrastructure. So, again, infill in kind of urban core areas. If you're doing a one lot or, one block infill development, an infill incentive district may not make sense. It may be some other strategy that is being considered.
Hey, Josh, one of the things too to think about is when you think about impact fees, if you're thinking about reinvestment in areas that are already developed, a waiver reduction or an impact fees makes sense. The picture you're seeing right there is a project in downtown Loveland. Downtown Loveland has a waiver of impact fees in the downtown, the commercial core, because they recognize that the police station's been built, the fire station's been built, the water, sewer, stormwater infrastructure already exists.
Great pointers, Mike. The next strategy we're going to talk about a little bit is the mixed use zoning districts. So many of our communities have great little downtowns, historic downtowns, or historic centers. Surprisingly, over the years, a lot of the zoning related to those areas became more restrictive than they were originally built on, which is kind of interesting to fathom. But so many of these have restricted downtown commercial areas or town centers so much that it's written out housing as an option, above these units. And then at the same time, sometimes those mixed use or downtown districts are so confined that it doesn't allow that district to expand and grow and kind of, transition into the other neighborhoods. And so it really creates a lot of great opportunities within your communities. And one of the key things there, though, before you just open the floodgates, is to really think of what types of uses you're comfortable with, depending on the context of that mixed use district. If it's in your core downtown area, very different context than maybe out near a highway center or another area of the community. And then what you really want to do is make sure that any vision helps, goes along with your comprehensive plan or a strategic plan for the community. And then start to dive into the zoning regulations, making the updates as you need. Know that you can do it incrementally and start to just kind of move the zoning around a little bit to see how it works best in the community for the downtown context. And you'll also hear us talking a little bit at a high level about parking, because parking is always a big topic with town centers, as well as we mentioned just a minute ago, the different uses. You don't want to give up too much retail space, but how can you balance the different types of uses and spaces that you have and the vacant lots that could be or are likely nearby? And then here, from the triple bottom line standpoint, the flexibility that this creates, having the opportunity to incorporate residential units above some of these businesses. So over time, smaller mom and pops tend to take over a lot of these shops or these building frontages, and the upstairs tend to get boarded up or underutilized. So it creates another revenue stream for those businesses and those local entrepreneurs in your community, and then also creates more life within the downtown or mixed use district, and as well as the walkability to the different businesses. So a case study example here you can see is Meeker, Colorado. They've actually just recently adopted some updated zoning regulations back in May of this year. And they've done a really good job, looking at from the outside and talking to them a little bit about their zone district. They've done a great job of bringing back that notion of residential in the town core and downtown area, and really helping foster more of a livability and livability of the downtown. So would encourage you to check that out. And you can see up in our complexity level scale there, this can really range. You can do this at a pretty reasonable to moderate complexity level, and you can also become more complex with it depending on the things you want to regulate with your zoning. I always try to strive more towards or lean a little bit more towards the kind of moderate to simple approach. So that way you can start to see activity and development occur within your community and start to get some affordable, attainable housing. Next up is cluster conservation subdivisions. So if this is kind of new to you, or you're not as familiar with cluster conservation subdivision, think of it in the sense of, traditionally, and this kind of pairs off with some of the things Mike was talking about earlier with minimum lot sizes, and land trust, land dedications, things like that. But, how many units fit in a certain tract of land, and how can smaller lots then preserve more open space, create more life and more wild space and woodlands, as you see here, I think, from this example. But really the key here is to identify your current minimum lot sizes and establish what your goals are. It could be conservation, it could be farmland protection, open space protection, maybe protecting view sheds or sensitive areas. So those are the things to kind of look at when you're looking to adopt adjusted lot sizes or this cluster conservation subdivision criteria. Next slide, please. So in terms of the triple bottom line, again, while the first bullet, opportunity to maximize density in units, that's great in the sense of development and activity, but it's really that next one that's accommodating new homes and different housing types within your community. And this also can serve as a transition to other areas within the community, some of the larger estate areas and or the rural farmland. It definitely enhances community and neighborhood character. I think, so many of us here during public hearings and public meetings, people want to be next to open space. They want to be near trails or parks. And this really helps you get there. And then, as I mentioned earlier, land conservation, really looking at opportunities to conserve the land around your community. And the example we have here is Larimer County. They do have conservation development and review criteria. Really neat guide, and it is available on their planning webpage. So would encourage you to check that out. Take a look at how it can apply to you and or your community, and the type of regulations you need to adjust along the way to get there. And then we're jumping right in. All right, so mobility and transportation. Here at a high level, we're going to just touch on the minimum parking standards and then dive into a little bit more of the multimodal street approach. So with minimum parking standards, a lot of smaller rural communities, even some of the rural resort areas, minimum parking standards may not apply to you directly because you don't have the issue of parking. Parking's not the issue, it's the development or having someone to build the products that you're looking for. But really this idea of looking at your parking standards, even adopting some standards if you don't have any, that allow for you to be creative and think through different options with development activity, especially if it occurs in a downtown area, a town center, a development node. How can you create flexibility? Because parking's expensive to build and dedicate a large chunk of land to just parking of cars, but then two, the environmental impacts, with parking, with the runoff and everything else. And so how do you want to balance that within your community and not break up your community fabric and character? And this picture is from Rifle, Colorado, where their parking regulations, and we're starting to see more of this with parking regulations. They may still establish, a 1-bedroom apartment still requires 1 unit. Single family detached still requires 2 parking spaces. But then what they do is they start to allow for adjacent on-street public parking as a credit, depending on the context. They also start to look at shared parking credit opportunities. And then kind of the third, which is becoming, we're starting to see more of trickling through some communities, this idea of an alternative parking plan, where a certain development can come forward and present a parking plan and a strategy that may be different than code, may require fewer parking spaces, but it allows for more freedom and creativity and flexibility because people are close to where they work. They can walk, they can bike, or they're near transit, depending on your context of your community. So really, there's a lot of great opportunities, a lot of great strategies out there regarding minimum parking standards. And it's not one of those areas that you need to shy away from or be scared of. We've worked with a number of rural communities that have really looked into parking standards and some of the flexibilities and creativity, and they're really adopting it, really enjoying that flexibility and some of that guidance that it gives staff as well as decision makers. All right, multimodal streets. So this is a great image. I believe this is from a Durango plan. So shout out to our it looks like Eva from Durango who's on the call. But thinking of multimodal streets and creating these areas that are pedestrian friendly, bike friendly, it's not just focused on the automobile. You'll often see a lot more CDOT funding coming out for different improvements along downtown corridors to add more outdoor spaces, public spaces, pedestrian environments, again, the bike lanes, detached bike lanes. So this really creates an opportunity to incorporate a more holistic transportation pattern in and around neighborhoods. And while multimodal streets may not directly relate as a first thought to affordable attainable housing, the idea that someone can bike or walk or take transit between their home and between where they work means that they don't have to spend as much on commuting costs, or their commuting costs are reduced. So there's a lot of different added benefits with this, which on the next slide, Mike, on our community values, we talk about reducing transportation costs. That small sense of small town living. If you think of a lot of our small rural communities, most of your neighbors as people are out and they're walking in the streets and they're walking between the school or taking their kids to the school or walking to the uptown store. So it creates a great social network for the community. And then, touching on the environmental side, it helps with that land conservation, creating different avenues for people to get to and from work, school, everywhere else they go. And then, of course, the overall air quality, which, again, depending on your context and where you're located, can be very, very important. The case study we have here is the city of Pueblo. This is kind of their downtown or city center district, transportation network, showing their different roadways and kind of their multimodal vision and plan. It really captures all the major avenues there, but a great resource to kind of think about as you're looking through different multimodal options and what that could look like for your community. You can see a sketch there that's incorporated with the plan. Multimodal streets definitely can become more complex, but I believe if you also look at the space that you have within your community, oftentimes there can be some quicker hit wins in terms of adopting different options for bike lanes or areas designated for pedestrians where there may not be any already. So there's a lot of different approaches that can go into looking at this overall strategy in part of your overall affordable, attainable housing approach. All right, this is our very final case best practice area. So it's resource conservation. You can see here we're going to touch on 4 different areas, diving into 3 of them in a little bit more detail. The first one being water conservation. We really want you to think of water conservation kind of, in a lot of different ways. It's not just conserving water, but it's how you're using water within a space. And water-wise, landscaping is always kind of the first thing that comes to mind for everyone. Eliminating turf, adding rock, adding plants, but there are all these other elements to it. And of course, if you're looking at landscaping specifically, you're going to look at code. You're going to look at your code criteria and what's going on there. In other areas of water conservation, you're going to start looking at water efficient appliances. And I know a lot of codes are starting to push that, as well as a lot of new developments to help cut down overall costs. But in terms of the irrigation side of things, think from the economic standpoint, cutting out your irrigation bill, reducing that. As water continues to become a scarce resource, and it seems like it's becoming more and more expensive every year with different tiered structures or water rate structures. And then, of course, from an environmental standpoint, really can help with some of the runoff and stormwater implications coming off from homes or from streets, and really help balance the community's overall investment in those capacities. Next slide, please. Case study we have here is Grand Junction. They have a really good water-wise landscape code. Really, really good details in terms of the balance between landscaping, turf, xeriscaping, and also understanding that notion of functional turf. Really trying to define that in parks, open spaces, instead of just having turf all over, it's how it's being used in the space. So that's a really good strategy to start looking into, and I'm seeing more and more communities starting to look that way. I know there was a strategy at Colorado Municipal Leagues, some discussions regarding water conservation this past June. Really a hot topic. I believe the room was packed full, if I remember standing in the back. So interesting topic. A lot of people are looking into this, and of course, a lot of it comes down to the overall cost of water. And as we talked about with transportation and some of these other strategies, it's the overall package of what affordable, attainable housing is. It's looking at all the different areas you're spending your money and resources with regard to your housing. The next topic is water rate structure. So this one we'll talk about a little bit high level, a little bit quicker. I know we're getting near kind of the end of our time here, but water rate structure, really looking at the different tiers within your water structure, and depending on where you're at and what your service provider is, you may have more control over this or you may not. But looking at your local structures, looking at how you could split those to address affordability criteria and also help balance overall water usage. And then on our next slide, key economic benefits. So again, by looking at the water rate structure and people that are using less water pay less, that can definitely help with overall cost of living. It helps address that utility costs, which then oftentimes people are using to put towards their housing. They can start to move up within the housing spectrum. The case study we have here, of course, more urban focused, definitely with Denver, but in terms of an overall tiered rate structure and kind of the approach they went through, it's one that can be replicated for rural and small communities at a different scale, of course. So something to consider, something to look at, and if you work with another utility provider, something to start talking through as part of ongoing negotiations and future development activity. So energy efficient codes. This one kind of goes hand in hand again with the water resource conservation and other strategies here. But how can we incorporate more high efficiency appliances, HVAC systems, solar panels, and then we touch on a little bit again water efficiency. But a lot of this has to tie into different legislative initiatives, but also what works for you at the local level. You're in charge of kind of your local building codes. What can you consider and look at to bring in more of these types of building products into your community and help reduce, again, just that overall cost to a resident or to a first-time home buyer. On the next slide, some of the key economic benefits, of course, the reduction in utility bills. That's a big one, especially as we continue to see utility bills increase, seems like every day. But then also that balancing the overall affordability, as I was saying, think of you're saving in utilities, so then where's that money being able to be spent that you otherwise would have paid on utility costs? And then the example we have here is from Basalt, Colorado, and this was the Habitat for Humanity Roaring Fork Valley Net Zero Housing Project. Really, incorporate great efficient units. They actually generate more electricity than they use, which is fantastic with the rooftop solar panels. I know they have, a number of teachers that live within this housing complex. So a really good asset for the community is really helping first-time homebuyers or those, single young professionals, first get into the housing market. And then as they start to build up their nest egg, they're able to kind of move up and create more housing for others along the way. And then the last topic we're going to touch on here real quick is high risk and sensitive area protection. So this definitely comes up a lot more in the rural resort areas, some of the rural areas, depending again on your context and local needs. But how do you restrict some of the development activity in those high risk areas and then ultimately protect those areas as well? Because if you're building in some of these high risk slope areas or near waterways, there's definitely more costs that come into the building picture. But then think of long term with insurance costs. We're definitely seeing insurance companies being more sensitive to where homes are being built, what's nearby, and the overall impact. So that's just another piece of the puzzle to look at in terms of the overall housing package. And this picture is from Estes Park and their recent comprehensive plan showing kind of those open areas and sensitive areas, but they definitely have a steep slope mitigation plan, and a number of communities up through the mountain areas have similar type plans or strategies to kind of help address sensitive areas and those higher risk areas within their communities. With that, Lisa, turn it back over to you to kind of wrap us up.
Thanks, Josh and Mike and Matt. So would love to answer any questions that people have either about the grant programs or any of these strategies. I did see one question come in the chat from Mark about how many communities have opted in, but I'm not quite sure what you're asking about. What are they opting in to?
Prop 123, I'm guessing.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
I was wondering if Mark is referring to Proposition 123.
Yeah. She's still on the call. Do you want to unmute yourself and? If it's Prop 123, I don't have those numbers in front of me. I know that there are a growing number of communities that are still joining. There's a lot of resources available to help figure out what the right numbers are in terms of housing, baselines and where you need to go. So if you do have questions, I'm going to put one of my colleagues, Robin DeFalco, is a really good resource for anything about that.
I believe Mark. I'm not sure if Mark is, but I believe Mark, I can't see, is from Elbert County.
All right, so I've just put Robin's name and email in the chat, and she can help with any of those questions. Anything else that people would like to ask? Any particular areas that you'd like to dig down into a little bit deeper?
I'd like to ask about people's experience with transfer development rights and kind of what price does a development right typically tend to garner? And like, are people willing to part with those? If you design to say, hey, these are the transfer zones and these are the receiving zones, like how much development pressure do you need to make that actually work?
I think that that's a good question, and I think that there are tax implications on that too. I mean, in terms of when somebody's making a donation like that, I think a lot of times it's established through kind of an appraisal process. Because it's not, I mean, a developer can't just say, well, this parcel is worth $5 million, so I'm going to donate it, I'm going to, transfer it and take that benefit. I think there's kind of an appraisal. There's a process that you have to go through to kind of establish that value. When thinking about kind of going that route, transfer development rights it's complicated and they're challenging. And so, I mean, I would say I'm not trying to discourage you if you have that opportunity to go that route, but I do think there are a lot of I mean, there's a lot of things you have to kind of keep in mind when you're going, when you're doing that. I'm sorry, was that helpful at all?
Let me follow up. So if you're going to implement transfer development rights, do you basically have to take away like the development right that comes along with subdividing land so that there's no automatic development right with the creation of a parcel? And can counties do that on larger than 35 acre parcels? Like, we can't regulate the subdividing of larger than 35 acres, but can we regulate whether or not we grant development rights to those newly created parcels?
I'm not following completely. Can you, is it, so what you're saying is if in a county situation, if you're taking away a development right in exchange for kind of some other benefit, is that what you're referring to? Or
no, it's like, I think like one of the things that we have in our situation is a lot of parcels that are 35 acres or larger.
Sure.
And a lot of new parcels that created fall into that category. Now those all just automatically create a new development right when they come into existence. And I think for TDR to work, or my question is, for TDR to work, do you have to limit the creation of new development rights in those cases?
I without kind of understanding your context directly, I'm thinking that, yeah, I mean, I think part of the transfer of development rights is the, whatever parcel, they're transferring is restricted in use as either ag or conservation easement or some other, so they're limiting any future opportunity to do any development with it. So so I think, yeah, that would be, I would assume that would be part of it, but I think without having a better understanding of the context, I'm cautious about speaking with a high level of certainty, I guess.
Yeah, and I would say, Sky, that Summit County has a pretty robust transfer development rights program through a lot of different valleys and regions within their county. They might be a great resource, and their website, they actually have a website that has transfer development rights, a lot of their criteria and regulations and some of that notion that might be a benefit to kind of glance at. But yeah, it's kind of Mike's point, like if you're taking development rights from one parcel, generally you're kind of stripping it of its development rights, and then those are being put on another parcel to increase either density or the viability of that area for the future or current development activity.
Thanks.
Yep. I just pulled a link. I'll throw it in for you to.
I was gonna say, I was trying to pull it from my PDF that I have of the presentation, but it wasn't copying over.
And they have a kind of a pricing kind of discussion in there. I mean, in Summit County, it's a little different than a lot of other communities, but.
It's a great question. Do we have any others? Other areas from the presentation, or maybe some of the practices that we didn't get into in a lot of depth?
Yeah, I have a quick question. This is Lucy from Town of Silverton. Is this Strong Communities grant only funding policy updates, or could the grant fund a specific project to implement one of the strategies, say like the cluster and conservation subdivision for affordable housing? Could we like fund the planning of that, or is this just for policy updates?
So it could, in theory, fund something like that. But you would still need to adopt a new strategy. So you can use it to help implement something like that, but there would have to be some other work, policy development work done in addition to that. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Yeah. So we could update general policy at the same time as we kind of create this strategic plan that would later be implemented, but we could kind of couple those together.
Right.
Okay. Got it. That makes sense. Thank you.
Any other questions? All right. I think that will do it for today then. Thank you all for joining us. We will get the presentations posted online, hopefully by the end of this week. And we'll give everybody back some time in your afternoon. Thank you all so much.
Cool.